Okay.
All right, am I good to go?
Yep.
All right, awesome. Well, today I wanted to talk to you all about North Korean human rights violations. And to start off, I wanted to share a nursery rhyme that every North Korean child learns. And it goes, "Our Father, we have nothing to envy in this world. Our house is within the embrace of the Workers' Party. We are all brothers and sisters. Even if a sea of fire comes toward us, sweet children do not need to be afraid. Our Father is here. We have nothing to envy in this world." And I wanted to start out with this because this is truly the way that North Korean people are raised. This is what they're raised believing. And so the problem with North Korea is not going to lie in the North Korean people, but in the North Korean regime. And so I just wanted to leave that as a basis of everything that I'll be talking about. And the major things that I wanted to talk about with the North Korean human rights violations are public executions, restriction of travel, labor camps, and the Arduous March, which I'll explain more about what the Arduous March is later. So with public executions, the crimes could range anywhere from stealing food to stealing copper wire from communication lines. The Committee on Information, which is a committee that's a subsidiary of the United Nations, wrote this about public executions in North Korea. They said, "As a matter of state policy, the authorities carry out executions with or without trial, publicly or secretly, in response to political and other crimes that are often not among the most serious crimes. The policy of regularly carrying out public execution serves to instill fear in the general population. Public executions were most common in the 1990s. However, they continue to be carried out today. In late 2013, there appeared to be a spike in the number of politically motivated public executions." And in order to understand what type of effect that this has on the people, I wanted to share a story that a North Korean shared about public executions. This is a book called Nothing to Envy, and it follows 6 North Korean people or families and their experiences in North Korea. And so specifically, I wanted to share about a man named Jun-sang. So it says, "Jun-sang witnessed the public execution one summer when he was home for summer vacation. For days, sound trucks have been driving by announcing the time and date. The head of the Iminban had knocked on doors telling people their attendance was required. The Iminban Iminbanjang is a person that's kind of the head of the community, and they would watch out. They would essentially watch the entire community and tell the government what they were doing. The Iminban is actually really interesting. I won't talk a whole lot about them, but they were even told at times to complain on purpose about the government and see how people reacted so then they could turn them in. But they were told them that attendance was required, and when they got there, this is how he described what was going on. The state security had converted the clearing by the stream into a makeshift courtroom, with tables set up for the prosecutors and a sound system with 2 enormous speakers. The man was accused of climbing electric poles and cutting copper wire to sell. The theft caused extensive damage to the nation's property and was done with the intention to damage our social system. It was an act of treason that aided the enemies of the social state," the prosecutor read, his voice bellowing through the scratchy speakers. Then a man acting as a sort of lawyer for the accused spoke, although he offered no defense. "I have determined that what the prosecutor says is true. The accused is hereby sentenced to death, and the sentence will be carried out immediately," decreed a third man. The man was tied at his eyes, his chest, and his knees, and 3 bullets were shot in each spot so that the man would end up in like a praying position, like he was asking for forgiveness. And it was said that the electric lines weren't working anyway where he'd stole copper wire from. The few meters of copper wiring the man had stolen probably had gotten him no more than a few bags of rice. So just to reiterate, you could be really killed for any sort of thing that was happening. Jang Jin-sung, a high-level political official, talked about his experience when he went to his hometown and was also forced into a marketplace to watch a public execution. And he was a poet, so he wrote, "The prisoner's crime, theft of 1 sack of rice. His sentence, 90 bullets to the heart." They're also restricted on travel. Another section with the Committee of Information said that citizens are not even allowed to leave their province temporarily or to travel within the country without official authorization. This policy is driven by the desire to maintain disparate living conditions, to limit the flow of information, and to maximize state control at the expense of social and familial ties. The North Korean government requires special permits in order for you to move inside of North Korea. This isn't including moving outside. If you move outside and are caught outside speaking to any sort of any South Korean official or to a Christian church, you're either immediately executed, sent to a gwaliso, which is a sort of labor camp that I'll explain later, or put into a long-term public detention or enlightenment center. And so they really cut down on these types of things. One story that I heard with, there's a North Korean writer who will send out stories from North Korea through Chinese smugglers, and one thing that he wrote about was a man that was asking for permission to go visit his mother back home, and he applied 3 different times, was rejected each of the 3 times, and decided he would go anyways, and he got on the train, got all the way to his hometown, gets caught, and then is sent to 3 months inside of a labor camp, during which time his mother died, which just kind of explains a little bit more in depth the type of situation that's going on in North Korea. With the labor camps, like the man in the story went to, there are 4 types of labor camps that I'll talk about. There's the jikyorso, which is just kind of a detention center, what we would think of as just jail. And it's for anything from skipping work to making a slightly negative comment about any sort of leader. If you were to make a comment about the great leader, then you would get to something more serious, but any sort of government official. Then there's the Rodong Dangyande, which is a labor camp, and the type of thing that you would end up doing in that sort of place would be a month or 2 of paving roads. For more serious offenses, you would get sent to either a gwaliso or a kyoaso, and the gwaliso is the worst of the worst. They're considered the control and management places, is the translation of a gwaliso, but it's modeled after a Russian gulag. And everyone in North Korea, and several people in this book, talk about people that have gone into the gwaliso. And when you go into the gwaliso, you don't typically come back out. That's why we have little to no information onto what happens in the gwaliso, because there are few survivors that have ever come back. If you are interested in the gwaliso, there's a book called Escape from Camp 14, which I believe is about a man that escapes one of these. And in 2018, there was roughly 200,000 North Koreans that were inside of these gwalisos. And in 2013, they said it would range somewhere in between 80,000 to 150,000 people that are still inside gwalisos. And this will range from individual people to entire families. Typically, if you do something and you are the head of your family, your entire family will be taken inside the gwaliso, and even the next generation sometimes. The last one I want to talk about is the kyoaso, which is the one we know most about. The kyoaso is the enlightenment center, which is for people that are non-political prisoners or people that have gone outside and then got captured while they were out there. I wanted to share another experience about what happens in these types of labor camps and the type of living conditions inside of them. There was a 16-year-old boy that was traveling back and forth between China, selling materials from China and North Korea. And he said that essentially, this is called kyoa, they're just numbered, so it's kyoaso number 12. There were 50 people to a room with sometimes 10 men sleeping under one blanket. And he tells about a man who was a rancher who failed to report the birth of a dead calf and instead took the stillborn calf back to his home and fed his wife and children with it. He was thrown into one of these kyoasos where he was treated poorly and eventually died in his sleep. It says that it was a common occurrence that somebody would die in the night. Often it was obvious in the close sleeping quarters because the dying man would evacuate his bladder and tiny bubbles would appear on his lips as fluid seeped out of his body. Usually nobody bothered to remove the body until morning. In this man's room alone, 2 to 3 men died each week. And this was especially serious during what was known as the Arduous March, or in Korean, the Gonan Haengun, which took place from 1994 to 1998. This happened when the support system that the North Korean regime was using, the Juche, the system of Juche, essentially fell apart and was no longer able to provide food for its people. During this time, they received $2.4 billion worth of aid, most of this actually coming from the US, but most of it ended up on the black market or in military stockpiles rather than the kindergartens or wherever they had said that it was going to be sent. During this time, there was somewhere between 600,000 to 2 million deaths from starvation or starvation-related illnesses, and that was as much as 10% of the population at that time. During that time, the hospitals were in terrible condition. They were running out of medicine or anything that they could really give people. And so one of the doctors that later escaped, said what they would do is they would tell them to bring in beer bottles if they wanted to get an IV. And if you brought in one beer bottle, then you would get one IV. And if you brought in 2 beer bottles, then you would get 2 IVs. The doctor then goes on to explain the type of situation that was going on inside of the hospitals. And this is what she said. The problem was with the food. Housewives had started to pick weeds and wild grasses to add to their soups to create the illusion of vegetables. Among older children and adults, there was another strange new affliction. The patients had shiny rashes on their hands, around their collarbones, and as though they were wearing necklaces, or around their eyes so that they looked like they were wearing glasses. In fact, it was pellagra, which is caused by a lack of niacin in the diet and often is seen in people who eat only corn. Most of the older children and the adults were more likely to survive if they were only getting pellagra, but most of the younger children during this time would die. They described it as there were children who had no diagnosable symptoms at all, just the vague malaise. They would appear pale or slightly bluish, their skin papery and lacking in elasticity. Sometimes they had swollen bellies, but sometimes nothing at all. So most of these children would die. One of the people in this book talked about how the students in her class went from about 30 students to about 10 students during this time because each one of them would just continue to die. And then she could tell when a student was going to die because when the student was going to die because the student would no longer get up for recess. They would just lay down, fall asleep, and wake up for the lessons again. Why does this matter? We've all either served in Korea or have some connection with Korea. If we're all studying, we all have some sort of feeling towards Korea. And there's always the feeling of Hannara. As you saw in the Olympics, they came under one flag. And if we're ever going to move towards reunification, then we're going to have to solve these problems that are taking place in North Korea or put some type of effort forth in order to pressure North Korea into fixing these things. And an understanding of these things will help us know what we can do in order to do them. Thank you for your time, and are there any questions?